So let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about Microsoft 365 security. And I know as you hear that, you might be thinking to yourself, wait a second, this is a topic that's talked about a lot. Today, we are not going to be repeating topics that you hear about a lot. We're going to be building on the existing strategies that exist and pointing out critical gaps that exist in those strategies. These are gaps that even if you invest in the best tooling, the major vendors that you have available to secure your Microsoft tenants, these gaps still exist. And as you're going to see today, as we talk through them, they're mission critical to resolve. And to talk through this, well, you've got myself. So I'm Rob Edmondson, Senior Director of Product Marketing here at CoreView. CoreView is a Microsoft 365 tenant resilience vendor. That's what we do. That's what our passion is. Our passion is exclusive focus on Microsoft 365 and how do we build extra resilience so you can survive the attacks that cyber attackers make on the environment, and you can recover going beyond just data backup. So we'll talk about what that means today. And I'm responsible for product marketing and strategy here at CoreView. Raghu, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, Rob. I'm Raghu Boddu. I'm one of the very few Microsoft security dual MVP in XDR SIM and security copilot category. I'm working as a technical director at Agile. So yeah, security has been my bread and butter. So that's about me.
Great, thanks, Raghu. So you've got a real security expert and Microsoft expert, exactly the kind of person we want to have here. And Sami, if you'd introduce yourself as well. Sami, you're on mute if you are speaking.
Sorry, my bad. Hi everyone, welcome also on my behalf. My name is Sami Lamppu, I'm Principal Cloud Security Lead based here in Finland and working in Elisa. I spend my days helping customers to enhance the environment security posture across the whole environment, leveraging the whole Microsoft security stack. I'm also Microsoft Security MVP and enjoying sharing what I've learned with the community. That's about me.
Excellent, thank you, Sami. So I've got two real experts with me today for this webinar, which means I've got to be on my best behavior with what I say and make sure everything's technically correct. And Raghu and Sami are going to be helping us very practically today as we talk about the challenges that are available, the gaps that exist in Microsoft 365 with practical advice on what you can do today to start taking action and experiences that they've had from the field. But just as we get started, actually one thing I do want to mention is Q&A will be available at the end. So please do write your questions, anything you want to ask about what we're talking about, put it in the question submission part of the GoToWebinar, and we will receive those and we will answer those at the end. And as we get started, I actually want to highlight something that I think is people rarely appreciate, and that is just how much Microsoft has changed since we moved to the cloud. So I want you to imagine it's the year 2010, and I tell you, I want to take your Active Directory and I'm going to put it in the cloud. Now, if it's 2010, you're going to think, why would I do that? That's really stupid. I would keep my Active Directory not only on-premise, but I would keep it in a segmented part of my on-premise environment, right? People usually have like a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, which is sectioned off of their normal network. It's really secure. So why would I put it in the cloud? That's a really bad idea. But I'm not done. Next, I'm going to tell you, I actually want to connect it to other clouds. And these are clouds that you ultimately don't have full control over. And I want those clouds to have privileged access back into your directory. And you would say, no way, this is a really bad idea. This sounds very insecure. Next, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to connect your Active Directory to a whole bunch of SaaS applications. You don't have any control over them. Lots of them, you don't even know who built them. And they're requesting privileged access from your directory. You're going to say, this is madness. Why would I do this? This is my most sensitive environment, and you're connecting it to things I have no control over. But I'm not done. I'm also going to propose that we build a vast digital workspace on top with 60 different apps and services. There's so many of them with so many icons, you can't even name them all. And every single day, we're going to keep releasing updates to these that you have no control over and adding new features. And all of these are connected to the internet. So you've got an Exchange server which can send and receive emails from anyone. You've got Teams and SharePoint environments which can have guest users in, and you don't even know who they are or what they're doing. They can even be inside of security groups, by the way. You're going to enable your employees to do external sharing of sensitive data and to have very little visibility and control over this. And you can even build applications in this environment, give them extreme levels of privilege, and use them from outside of the tenant. Now, if I said this to you in 2010, you would say, this is actually laughable. No one would do this. Here's the astonishing thing. What I've just described is Entra with Microsoft 365 built on top. Entra is Active Directory on steroids in the cloud, exposed to a whole bunch of people and data and environments that you have no control over. What's really interesting here is that there's two things being brought together that you would never put together normally. One is your most sensitive environment, your directory, and the other is a highly collaborative digital workspace. Microsoft decided one day that putting these two things together in one package was a good idea. And actually, most organizations, most security teams simply have no choice in this matter because there is nothing else that can replace Microsoft 365. So you just have to accept this. But what this means is Microsoft 365 has unique security risks. And the first one I want to start with today that we are seeing as an organization, CoreView, we get called into some of the largest organizations in the world to deal with data breaches that happen in Microsoft 365 environments. There is one thing we see in almost every single breach. It is configuration drift and configuration tampering. Attackers know that you can't detect when they change configurations in 365. And this is why we believe these attacks are surging. In the first half of 2025, configuration drift was rated as the #1 cloud security threat, according to Cybersecurity HQ. We also saw Microsoft's own data. When they looked back at 2024, they had 1 month, I think it was May of that year, where they detected 176,000 instances of configuration tampering in non-Microsoft environments. Okay, so they weren't detecting this in Microsoft 365 because for some reason that's too challenging for them, but they were detecting it in other environments, which is an astonishing number of tampering events in just 1 month. Sophos XOps saw a 79% increase in configuration tampering of Defender across a 2-year period. If you think about it, it makes total sense. Everyone is starting to adopt Defender's different capabilities. And if I can go in and turn off this capability or change this setting, I can change your security posture. And there's no alerting to tell you about that. Also, Picus did an analysis, and this is, I think, really telling. They looked at all the MITRE attack techniques. I think there's about 250 of them. They looked at them and they asked which ones are being used the most. T1562, which is impaired defenses, was ranked in the top 1%. This was highly preferred by cybercriminals. What is impaired defenses? Basically, I take your current security tooling, how it's configured, how it's set up, and I impair it so it works to my benefit. I turn things off, I change settings. So whether you're looking at Microsoft or other environments or whatever, cybercriminals are relying on the fact that you can't detect when these settings change. And I think this is also very telling. Microsoft's own internal documentation and data tells us that if you misconfigure Entra, or if you misconfigure Intune, the risk of data breaches goes up significantly. So in the case of Entra, if I go in there and tamper with certain settings, Microsoft said ransomware is 40% more effective in some cases. And in the case of device compromise, that can increase by up to 70% if I can misconfigure Intune. Something very ironic for you, by the way. Just last year, Microsoft rolled out an update which broke customers' Intune device compliance profiles, basically demolishing the configurations that they'd set up, leading to more device compromise. So don't assume it's just attackers who can hurt your configurations. Even Microsoft's own updates can do it as well. So when we think about configuration drift and configuration tampering, we need to be very aware of cyber criminals who do this. But another thing I want to ask you is, if you ever accidentally had one of your own team members accidentally delete critical configurations, because this happens too. You've got Microsoft rolling out updates. You've got cyber criminals changing configurations to move through your environment. But also, it can be your own internal teams that accidentally do it too. So let me ask, Sami, why don't we start with you? Have you ever been involved in an incident where a customer or a client has accidentally deleted something critical in terms of configurations?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes, I have been too many times. But actually, this question reminds me back in the days when I led the Active Directory team. And one case came to my mind, that when we got a call approximately 4 p.m. from customer who had deleted OU, organizational unit, from on-prem AD that contained 800 computer accounts. So, and a side note for this story is that this was way back before AD recycle bin. So there wasn't basically only option we had was authoritative restore for the specific OU and an AD. But even though we had processes in place, we have guidances in place, we realized that, okay, these backups were not usable at all. Those were not working. So what we needed to do, we actually rolled back a few weeks old backup from the tape, and needed to do authoritative restore again. So in a nutshell, this whole process took something like 8 hours. At the end of the day, everything was fully restored. Users actually never noticed anything was wrong. Customers was happy, and of course it was a stressful moment for all of us. But it really showed how critical reliable backups and recovery processes really are.
Amazing. That's a awful experience, I imagine. But thank you for sharing your story, Sami. Raghu, how about yourself? Have you ever had an experience like this? If you are speaking, you're on mute, just so you know.
Yeah, I would love to. I was saying that, I would love to say no, but there were many cases, I've seen with the customers, like you mentioned, right? It's not even just because of the attackers, right? There were like 2 cases I just wanted to highlight, right? One, external attack. The other one was like it's an internal team issue, right? So because the company was going through the mergers and they were trying to do some configuration changes, applying some patches and everything, and accidentally, right? So our team deleted some of the configuration, but they were struggling to restore how they wanted to do that. Like you mentioned one very good point, right? Like the defenders and other things comes with a very strong rules, features, configuration. Like see, Sami and myself, we published a book, right, with the details on how we can enforce this setting. But with one click, right? When you tamper the defender, nothing, everything goes away. So that's why it's this is very important, right? I mean, you need to have a continuous monitoring, and who's changing it and who's accessing it. Yeah, but yeah, it's going to be very painful for customers for sure.
Thanks, guys, for sharing these horror stories. You're not the only ones who see this. We also have seen this in our time in CoreView. There's some interesting things I'd like to share with those of you on the webinar. Just examples, okay? I'm not going to name names, but I want to give you some thought experiments, which I think can be really eye-opening. So let me give you one here. This was a Fortune 500 company, and they had an incident. And they knew that someone had got privileged access into their Microsoft 365 tenants, and they knew that some configurations had been changed because it was obvious, certain things had changed, certain things had happened, but they didn't know how many configurations had been changed, because sometimes if you change a configuration, it's not obvious. You don't get an instant disaster. It's a silent change. The other thing to bear in mind here is how many different types of configurations are there in a Microsoft 365 tenant? There's actually about 10,000 different details that you can play with. You've got configurations, but underneath those configurations, you've got details that can be set as well. Across all the different apps and services, there's like 60 of them. There are about 10,000 configuration details. In fact, there's probably a lot more than that compared to when we last counted. So this organization knew that some had been changed, but they didn't know how many, and they didn't know if they'd been changed across all their tenants. How would they check? How would they know? The only way for them to do this was to do a manual audit. So this meant 2 weeks of a team going through and reviewing everything and asking different people, how is this supposed to be set? Is it still correct? So this was a huge amount of time where they had no confidence. It turns out not much had changed, by the way, but because they didn't have visibility of the changes, they had to go through and review anyway. I think this is just really highlights the importance of visibility, because if they had visibility, they would instantly know and they could instantly fix in minutes rather than weeks. Another example here, which I want to give, this is a horror story which we hear about sometimes, and this is why we use this phrase, total tenant takeover. You'll have noticed that in the header of the presentation. This was a government agency. Again, I'm not going to name names, won't tell you where they were. Very large government agency. If you knew, you'd be shocked. Someone got control of their entire tenant, so they got privileged access to a very high level, took over the entire environment, and kicked all the users out. And they basically said to the organization, they said, look, we'll give you your tenant back if you pay this much money. So it wasn't ransomware, but they did effectively hold the tenant to ransom. So the organization said, oh, well, we've got our backups and we've got all of our restores. So let's just restore our data into a new tenant. And instantly they began to find some problems. So the first issue they had was the data actually wouldn't restore into their tenant, because the tenant wasn't configured the same way their old tenant was, which is very interesting. Then they began to ask, well, how do we reconfigure the tenant to match the old settings? Two problems. Number one, they didn't know how the old tenant was configured because they hadn't documented it. But number two, even when they started to review how that was done and build a picture of that, they had to do it manually. The time estimated to do this fully was going to be 3.5 weeks until they could know that the new tenant was configured exactly the same way. And you can imagine that's a long time to be down and a long time to basically not be able to work. The amount of money it would have cost them is vast. So a real example here, we hear about this quite a lot. People lose access to their tenant and only then they realize how much reconfiguration there is to do. And finally, this is an example of, I guess that's quite similar to what Sami mentioned. We actually were woken up early in the morning, our VP of engineering in 2024, a brand new CoreView customer who was midway through rolling out the solution. They called us up, they said, oh my gosh, we've accidentally deleted all of our distribution groups, which is quite easy to do if you have access. You can go in and just delete all of them. This was an organization where every morning, the operations were built on that distribution group. So you would send emails out based on those distribution lists to the entire organization to update them on everything that was going on and what they needed to do. And that wasn't going to be possible the next morning. Luckily for them, they had just started rolling out CoreView, which meant they could instantly roll back and get those back. But just a classic example of, you can have cyber attacks, but you can also have your internal staff make mistakes. So I want to give you an analogy here before we start getting a bit practical. I want you to think about a glass of water, because I suspect many of those on the webinar, you'll actually be familiar with this concern, right? You understand that Microsoft 365 has lots of configurations, and that if they're changed or if someone takes them away from you, it has huge implications. But how do you explain this to your colleagues? How do you communicate this and evangelize this important concept to your teams? So think about a glass of water. The tenant is the glass and the water is your data, okay? So the glass is actually under attack because cyber criminals are changing configurations, deleting chunks of them, or maybe just taking the whole glass away. So we're seeing that right now. And the water, of course, is under attack too. That's the data. Here's the problem. If I take the glass and I throw the water on the floor, you're okay because you can restore the water back in because the water is your data. You have your data backed up, or at least I hope you do. You've got your emails backed up, all of this stuff. So if you're using Veeam, Rubrik, whoever, you can restore your data and get back running relatively effectively. But cyber criminals might sometimes take the glass and throw it on the floor. They might damage it. They might start chipping away at it, or even compromise it so much that it's not really suitable to hold the water, the data inside. Here's the problem. If that happens to you, what do? You've got the water backed up, but you don't have the glass, the tenant configurations backed up. So if I pour the water in, it's going to pour out. You've got a data leak, okay? This is the best way to explain this to your colleagues. Now, not every single environment in your business needs configuration backup. If you look at, I don't know, Monday.com or Canva, right? Firstly, these are not critical or sensitive environments. And secondly, even if they were, the number of configurations is small, right? It doesn't take you that long to figure out how to reconfigure it. Microsoft is the opposite. It is incredibly sensitive. If I misconfigure Entra Defender, I change your security posture. But it's also mission critical and has a vast number of configurations. So it's uniquely important that we have the glass backed up here. I would use this analogy when you're trying to explain this to your colleagues to highlight, hey, we've got our data backed up. Do we need to look at backing up our tenant configurations as well? And also, one other thing you can use this image for, you might want to take a screenshot, by the way, if you're thinking about communicating this to your team. Ask your team, do we know whether we are the glass on the left, or we're on our way to the middle, or maybe we're over on the right? Do we know? And the answer is most organizations don't, because unless you have visibility of your configuration state and you're measuring it against a baseline, by the way, Microsoft themselves recommend that you use baselines, even though they don't really provide them, then you have no way of detecting where you are. With that said, let's get practical. Let me start with Raghu. Can you give our listeners some advice on, if someone said, look, I'm concerned about configuration drift, visibility, configuration backup, what should I do? What would you say?
So definitely, right, like you said, right, I mean, it's very important to have a visibility, right? Without visibility, you're going to miss a lot of things, because we had a similar customer where they were under the attack, and they had to rebuild everything from the ground, but the last recent configuration was also encrypted, right? So they picked the last best one, but again, there are so many gaps, right? So to avoid all this, right, I mean, it's very important to have a, like you said, baseline to be created. Process needs to be there, but before all that, right, you need to have the visibility. No matter how many process you have in place, like taking a backup of all the configurations and everything. So, and that's one of the thing, and I strongly believe. And when I say visibility, right, it's not just only in one tool, right? Because especially post COVID, right, there are so many tools, right, so many things. Like every vendor comes up with their own visibility on configurations and everything, but the true unified configuration view is missing in most of the companies, right? I think that's very important thing to consider for any organization.
Thanks, Raghu. And Sami, would you add anything?
Yeah, in Microsoft Cloud environment, we know that configuration changes are part of daily operations. They happen constantly, and as you already mentioned, the real risk isn't the change itself, but the changes you actually don't notice. So, taking that into account, those what you don't notice, those can be impact the service availability, weaken your security posture, or quickly become also part of attack kill chain in a worst case scenario. So what you need to have, in my opinion, is a proper auditing, least privileged access and change monitoring in place, so you can easily see or have the visibility, as Raghu mentioned, for the changes and the critical changes in the ecosystem. And in addition, having configuration backups and backups provides definitely a safety net for needed to restore trust and control in case of disaster or major attack in the environment.
Thanks, Sami. Both, I think, incredibly important, starting off with visibility and building up the backups. And just to give you guys some more granular details here, like a great question to ask is, how many configurations do we have in our tenant or tenants? Because if it's a low number, you have a lower amount of reconfiguration time. If it's a high number, that changes things. Also, when you're looking at configurations, weigh them based on the environment. If somebody deletes or changes configurations in Entra, Intune, Defender, SharePoint, Teams Exchange, Purview, the admin center, this is critical. If somebody deletes configurations in Loop or Planner, it's less critical. So, weigh that up and focus on the critical stuff. Some organizations, if they're not ready to deploy new tools, they will take screenshots of different admin portals. We work with organizations that use Excel sheets, so they will document each configuration in there and then do an ongoing review. So basically what they'll do is every 2 weeks, they'll have a team of people go through and review all the configurations and just do that on an ongoing basis. That Excel sheet then can also act as a foundation. If you need to reconfigure your tenants, you've at least got an Excel sheet with the basics written in there, which will speed up the process, albeit it's still going to take a long time. Something else to consider is actually testing your data backup in an unconfigured tenant. Does it work? Because if it doesn't, then your data backup is actually doesn't have any value unless you also have a configuration backup. And we see sometimes that actually doesn't work. Like I mentioned, restoring the data without the right configuration can sometimes not work. You want to see whether that's the case for you. So we talked here about one of the solutions, which is Excel and screenshots. Microsoft did have a tool called DSC, Desired State Configuration. It's still available. It is currently being replaced by something called BSM, which is Baseline Security Mode. Right now, the tool unfortunately has extremely limited coverage. So it only covers about 20 configurations. So it's very, very immature, but definitely something that you need to look at. There's also data backup vendors. So Veeam and Rubrik sometimes cover basic Entra configurations, but unfortunately they have no plan to cover the actual tenant, which includes Intune, Defender, SharePoint, Teams, Exchange. So it's only doing a very small slice of the tenants. The other option, of course, is to look at dedicated tools like CoreView, the company I work for. We actually have a configuration manager, which is enterprise ready, which covers all of your critical configurations, detects drift, etc. But we'll talk about that later. I actually now want to get onto the second half of the coin, which is to do with privilege. Because you might be thinking, well, wait a second. Yes, there's a configuration problem, but some of these stories involve excessive levels of privilege. And in the case of total tenant takeover, yes, I wish I had my configurations backed up, but I also wish I didn't have so much privilege in my environment that a cyber criminal can literally take over the entire thing. Often this is the result of excessive levels of privileged access. It might shock you that Microsoft themselves, when they go and do incident response, they report that 63% of the tenants they investigate are failing on least privilege. So it's very helpful. Thank you, Microsoft. Pretty shocking data point. But the important question is why? And the answer actually points the finger back at Microsoft themselves. So I want to give you an analogy here. I think many of us live in apartments. So I want you to imagine you're going shopping for a new apartment, you're going to rent one, and they're already expensive. But one day, one appears and it's half the price of the other apartments. It's twice as big and it's in an even better location. And you go and view it and you fall in love. You think this is exactly where I want to live. It's perfect. There's only one condition though. In the apartment block, you've got, I don't know, 20 apartments, and none of them have doors. None of them have locks. And what that means is every person can enter each other's apartments and you don't know who these people are. And there are always people moving in and out. Would you move in? The answer is no. Unless you're crazy, and fair play, if you said yes, I would still do it. I respect you. But most people would never do it. And the reason is this. Yes, the value of the apartment is its beauty, its size, its location. All of that drives up the value. But the fundamental need you have is for privacy and segmentation. This is my private space, and I know no one can come in here and mess it up. Here's the thing. When you live in a Microsoft 365 tenant, there are no boundaries. So I can give you a privileged account for Exchange, okay? And that privileged account, yes, it only has privileges for Exchange, but it can manage mailboxes across the tenant. It is extremely powerful. It's tenant-wide. And we've seen this actually with organizations who have been forced to move to Microsoft 365 from on-premise. They've moved from Active Directory and now they're in, and they're shocked. Because earlier, Sami was talking about OUs. On-premise Active Directory had OUs. In the cloud, Microsoft does have something called AUs, but they're very limited in terms of the whole tenant. And we'll talk about that in a moment. The most important thing here is your most privileged environment actually has very few serious least privilege controls. So like I said, if I give you that Exchange admin, or if I give you an admin for a SharePoint environment, it's going to have access for those parts of the tenant across the entire tenant. So if I'm in South America and I get an Exchange account, and there's also a team in Europe who are in the same tenant, my Exchange account can also manage their environment. That's very dangerous. And that's why it's so easy for cyber criminals to move through the tenants, because if they compromise one privileged account, it's got so much access that I can quickly move through to other environments and do all sorts of things. So we need to get practical. How do you deal with this? And there are some things you can do with Microsoft to help with this. But first, I want to throw a question to Sami. Let's start with you. What's the most tenants you've ever seen an organization use?
I would say the typical environment where I work with, they have one tenant. That's a typical approach. But of course, reasons vary, and there are organizations which have multiple tenants. The biggest I've seen is more than 10. It was something like 10 to 11 tenants, and they are growing all the time. So it really depends on the organizations, and of course you might have some issues with the management in such environment, of course.
Amazing. And Raghu, how about yourself?
Like most of the times, commonly we see like 2 or 3, right? But it depends, like a major customers I've seen somewhere between 10 to the max I've seen like 15.
Wow. And the reason that people want to move down to one tenant is to avoid complexity, right?
Complexity, but practically it doesn't happen most of the times because the acquisitions, a lot of other things, right? The billing, issues. One practically, for the major large companies, it's difficult, honestly.
Yes. Yeah, we see this as well. And organizations usually want the simplicity of fewer tenants, but they often end up having 1, 2, 3, or an acquisition here or there. There is one big benefit to that, though, which actually comes back to how we solve the privilege problem. But I'll come to that in a moment. First, I want to ask you guys for your advice for people who, maybe they are concerned, they're using the out-of-the-box privileges in Microsoft, and they are concerned that they have too big of a blast radius, that they give too much access. Actually, what can you do to reduce the amount of privilege and reduce the blast radius? Sami, let's start with you.
When we're talking about high privilege users and those accesses to the environment, those are top targets for adversaries. And that being said, the controlling those permissions is critical, as you already mentioned. The tricky part is also that those accesses can build up over time without anyone noticing. If tenant is old and so on, we know how it goes. But what is really important is to have visibility to be able to trim the unused permissions, and then you get to the environment in a better shape. My advice in general, if I sum this, is to enforce least privilege, use just-in-time access like privileged identity management instead of permanent roles. And what is also really important is regular review role and also application permissions and remote stale assignments.
Great, thank you, Sami. Raghu, what would you say? Would you build on top of that, or mostly the same?
So definitely, right. The blast radius is one of the most important thing. A lot of times, what happens, right? We see like these organizations, work with the vendors, contractors. They'll be coming in. Sometimes they need to elevate their, access privileges, right? So most often times, right, like you forget it, right? I mean, either you give it for a short time, or maybe due to some issues, another thing you extend it, then you forgot to revoke those access. So I think strong access reviews needs to be in place, and the visibility is the most important thing, right? You need to see the blast radius, how bad it can be, right? Irrespective of what process you have it, because it's human, right? So human can do errors, but when you have a visibility, we can go back and fix it quickly, right? So like Sami said, right, just in time, and PIM privileges and those things, definitely everybody should consider.
Great, thanks, guys. There's a few things that I've put up here on the screen as well. Is as we look at this, review the attack escalation path. if a privileged account or app is compromised. This is, I think I'm preaching to the choir here. Most folks will do this, but ask yourself, okay, out of the 20 people who are working on our Microsoft environment, if one of them gets compromised, if one of their accounts actually is maliciously used, how quickly could a total tenant takeover, for example, happen? And if it's very quick, then this should be a high priority for how we remediate this. What happens if someone creates new apps or new accounts? Just a couple of years ago, Microsoft themselves were compromised and breached because someone created Entra apps in their environment. So this is very important. What happens if an internal user misuses an account? And I actually think a great example of this is to think through the North Korean attacks that are happening right now. For those of you who aren't aware, these attacks involve North Koreans posing as Americans or Europeans. They will create a LinkedIn profile. They will use stolen social security information, and they will then apply for jobs, posing as sort of national Americans or Europeans. When they go into the video interviews, because these days so few interviews are actually done in person, they will use really sophisticated deepfake and AI technology to appear to be someone else. And then as soon as they get the job, they're given a degree of access into the IT environment. Now, the massive irony here is you're actually paying a cyber criminal to get access to a sensitive environment, which is unbelievable. That's how far these attacks have come now. And then you might be thinking, well, what happens with the laptop that I send them? Well, they actually have an American, or a recent case, actually, there was an American working for these North Koreans, and that person had received 200 different laptops from different businesses where this was happening to their address. And so the laptops were still in America, and then they were being remotely accessed by a North Korean from outside the country. So it's very sophisticated, and these attacks are happening all the time. Now, why am I talking about this? You might be thinking, very interesting, but why? Ask yourself, if this happened to your organization and you gave that person privileged access, and maybe it's happening right now, who knows, how much access would they get? Because these attacks are happening. Would it be a small amount, which would make it hard for them to move through your environment? Or would you be giving them like an Exchange admin, an Intune admin, or whatever, which could be really devastating? It's a really good example to make us ask, should we even be giving anyone real privileged accounts in Microsoft 365? Now, in terms of solutions, it's actually quite granular in Microsoft 365. At least it appears it in the first instance. You've got 120 admin accounts. Like I said, though, some of those are still tenant-wide. I mean, if I give you a SharePoint admin account, it still has SharePoint control across the whole tenant. Most admins simply do not need that level of access. There are a lot of permissions that you can assign to people in apps. There's actually 800. Now, ask yourself, is that good or bad? In some ways, it's good because there's lots of options. It's bad, though, because how do I possibly remember them? And they're constantly changing. And remember as well that an example of one of these permissions would be something like application read write all. That's one of these permissions. That permission has so much power. You can basically reassign permissions associated with applications, which can give them huge privileges. Just one of these permissions can still be extremely dangerous. So really, the native accounts and permissions don't solve the problem of least privilege. It's not an easy way. The other option you've got is admin units. So Microsoft has this feature where you can sort of segment based on users, and I think they do devices now as well, but it doesn't do anything for SharePoint. It doesn't do anything for Teams. It doesn't really work for Exchange, and there's a whole bunch of the tenant where you still can't segment. The really concerning thing about this is Microsoft has been building admin units now for 11 years. They were originally announced, I think it was sort of 2015, after people had started adopting Microsoft 365, and they were complaining, why are there no OUs, right? Like Sami mentioned for AD. So Microsoft started building these. It's just taking so long for them to release new features. So these are helpful to start with, but very quickly you're going to realize a lot of the use cases aren't covered. The other thing, and this is why I thought it'd be interesting to ask the multi-tenant question, is some organizations choose to exist in 5, 10 tenants, and however complicated that is, at least it provides some segmentation. The downside is now you've got 10 tenants to configure. Okay, so earlier we were talking about how do I know that my configurations are where they're supposed to be? That is a nightmare for one tenant. If you have 10, it is an even bigger nightmare and it builds a stronger business case for why you need to have centralized configuration management. So we actually call this the tenant dilemma. If you've got one tenant, the blast radius is too big. If I have more tenants, the configuration issue grows. Either way, it's really challenging. So really the native solutions in Microsoft aren't great. Now, I feel like we've really talked about the problem a lot here, and I'm just going to take 10 minutes now to talk about the solution and about why CoreView is approaching all of this from a new angle. And then we'll wrap up with some Q&A as we finish. So there are some huge gaps in the existing market, and I just want to highlight them very quickly because I think it's a real eye-opener. Firstly, you've got SaaS security posture management tools, things like App Omni, Recode Balance. These are great tools, okay? So what they do is they integrate with hundreds of different SaaS applications. And the promise is basically, look, we're going to detect misconfigurations in SaaS. And so a lot of people think, well, if I have this, maybe this will help me with Microsoft 365. And it does. It covers some basic configurations, maybe a few configurations here or there. The problem is there are still so many configurations in a Microsoft tenant that they do not monitor. And so it's very easy to tamper with a Microsoft tenant and still not get an alert because these SSPM tools are only going to look at a small fraction of your tenant. Similarly with privileged access management, I wonder if some of you have been thinking, well, hey, we've just spent all this money on privileged access tools. And now you're talking to me about privileged in Microsoft 365. The promise of these tools and the whole industry initially was we're going to enable least privileged operations, so no one has too much privilege. The truth is, really, there's still an extreme blast radius everywhere because what these tools tend to do is they identify privileged accounts and then you put them in a vault and you make sure that people authenticate when they use them. It's a great start, but in reality, it doesn't change the fact that the accounts have a huge blast radius because they don't change the accounts themselves, they just manage them. So organizations around the world still have extreme levels of privilege. It's just that those are being put into a vault now, but it doesn't actually implement least privilege. It doesn't solve that problem. You've got the data backup vendors, Veeam, Rubrik, Commvault. The promise was we'll be able to get you going after an incident. What we're beginning to see is because they don't back up the full tenant configuration, there is a huge gap in business continuity plans. And actually, even tools like your advanced email and endpoint security tools, they promise to deal with critical attack vectors. There's some really interesting things about this. If I get control of Intune, I can deploy a malicious application onto your endpoints, even if you spent $10 million on Trend Micro or whatever it is. If I get control of your Exchange environment, I can change how your mail flow works, meaning that you might have really sophisticated email filters in place, but I can do things to bypass those. So this really highlights it's so critical to have enhanced security upstream. Intune, Exchange, they depend on having rigorous configuration detection. So if someone starts to do that, you detect it, you stop it. Because otherwise you're able to invalidate all of this investment that you're making. Now, if you look across all of these things, all of them have provided huge value, but specifically when it comes to Microsoft 365, they're leaving huge gaps, and that's not acceptable. So this is why CoreView has created what we call Microsoft 365 Tenant Resilience. Cybersecurity and operational resilience that treats Microsoft 365 like the uniquely sensitive, critical, and complex beast that it is. So the idea here is basically to say we are going to focus exclusively on the Microsoft 365 tenant, and we're going to build extra resilience that covers all of those gaps I just talked about. And there's just 5 points to it. It's very simple. The whole idea is we anticipate, withstand, and recover from attacks in M365 and Entra. We've got a wonderful endorsement here from Microsoft who say basically you gain tenant resilience and strengthen your security posture when you use CoreView. Here are the 5 points. Number one, we help you harden your tenants against attacks. So we have a CIS configuration baseline, which has CIS's statement of what is an ideal tenant configuration. We have a baseline which documents all of that, and you can synchronize that to your tenant. It's a gold image, and we can immediately detect where your configurations are out, so you can put them back into a secure status. You can also use this to deploy dev and test tenants so that you can test new configurations in a secure environment rather than immediately rolling them into production. And then who knows what's going to happen, right? You might break something, you might lock users out. So we can help you build dev and test tenants with this baseline so you can test configurations in a secure environment. And we have a whole bunch of collaboration level security to detect all these high risk access points. Things like highly privileged Entra applications, guest users in sensitive environments, users that don't have proper MFA or security for when they access the tenants, suspicious mailboxes, all of these things which are creating access points, we can detect them and remediate them for you. Secondly, even if someone gets into your environment, even if they compromise your tenant, we are going to help you segment your tenants and remove privileged accounts so you no longer need them. What this means is the thing they're targeting, privileged accounts, won't be available for them. So the way we do this is we have virtual tenant segmentation. So even if you're in just one tenant, you can create admin boundaries inside the tenant like little apartments. So when we use that apartment analogy, it's like having an apartment block and each apartment is completely isolated. And I delegate access to that part of the tenant, and that's all you can have access to. By the way, this is really big. If you want to securely adopt AI, you need to have this kind of segmentation so you can prevent it from going too far. The cool thing about this is admins actually work through CoreView, meaning you can deprovision the powerful privileged accounts that cybercriminals are targeting, massively reducing the breach blast radius. If someone compromises one of these users, or you accidentally, God forbid, accidentally hire a North Korean impersonating an IT worker, the amount of access they're going to have is going to be so limited. It's extremely granular. I can give them access to this site. I can give them access to this part of Teams, this mailbox, or this device. And it's all done through an easy to use wizard. So you can literally give people only what they need for the environment they're in. Next, if they get in and somehow start tampering with configurations, CoreView constantly monitors over 8,000 details across your tenants. As soon as someone tampers, you'll get an alert. If someone creates a new Entra app with privileges, you'll get an alert. And there's a whole bunch of other tenant threats that we're monitoring for, whether it's device compliance policies or, like I mentioned, suspicious mailboxes. They might set up mail forwarding, so they keep getting sensitive emails after they leave the tenant. CoreView detects these things and remediates them and alerts you if someone's doing them right now. After an incident, okay, so let's imagine now someone manages to compromise your tenant despite you hardening it, despite the segmentation. Somehow they move through your environment. Somehow they tamper with a configuration, which is basically impossible now, but let's just say it happens. And now they go and they take over your entire environment, they kick you out. Well, CoreView has configuration backup. You can immediately see who changed what in your environment. After an incident, you can restore your configurations, and you can basically do an instant rewind. So it's like pressing rewind on a remote control. You can go back to where you were, meaning you can restore your tenant configurations in minutes rather than weeks. And finally, CoreView doesn't just provide all of this security resilience, cyber resilience, it also provides operational resilience. One of the reasons people have a lot of holes in their Microsoft environment is because they are under so much pressure, they can never close them. Audits. Every time you get audited, everything shuts down. You have to do all of this reporting. Attacks. When an attack happens, it's all hands on deck. A merger and an acquisition. Suddenly you're trying to consolidate tenants. Or maybe you just have an unpredictable spike in service demand. And now all of the things that you've been just about holding together, it's already gone to hell. Now, you know, all the complexity of Microsoft 365 was already a nightmare, but in these moments, that's when things break. Access reviews get skipped, misconfigurations occur, users don't get offboarded, and this is where the gaps and the sprawl begins to happen. CoreView provides all sorts of capabilities so that your admins are always able to stay on top of their game, even when the pressure hits. We help you automate joiner, movers, and leavers processes. So users are onboarded automatically. They are removed automatically. You can reassign them to new roles. using templates, so you don't have to do all this complicated reconfiguration. You can actually give low-level admins privileged access without excessive privilege as well. So this is really powerful. You may have regional teams who actually can't do administration in the Microsoft tenant because you give them too much privilege, like what we talked about. I can't give this junior admin access, it's too dangerous. Because of our tenant segmentation capabilities, you can give your low-level admins access so they can do self-service administration on their own users, and it's secure. You're not giving them excessive levels of access. We also have something called user rewind, so you can detect when users when changes have happened to users. They might call you up and say, I've got this problem, my device isn't working, I can't access this. Normally you have to go through a whole troubleshooting procedure. With CoreView, we can show you exactly what changed with that user over the last couple of days, and you can just press a button to rewind it, immediately solving the issue. And lastly, we have Corey AI, which is an AI wingman for Microsoft 365 administrators. Imagine ChatGPT, but you can use it to manage things inside of your tenant at your own discretion. So you can say, hey, I want to see a report on all the users who've got into this group or all the changes that have happened here, or I'd like to see any user that has mail forwarding or whatever it is. It's going to show you instantly. And it can also do things. You can manage users, you can manage security groups, you can reset passwords. It's really an incredible piece of technology. And Corey only has access to the specific tenant segments that you build. So it's extremely granular. All of these capabilities are pretty unique. There's no other vendor out there that does them like this. And they're dedicated to 365 so that your most critical environment has that extra level of resilience. With that, there's actually just one more thing to share, which is if you're thinking, well, okay, I want to check out what's really going on with my tenant, we actually have a tenant security health check. It's free. You can use the QR code on screen. If you're particularly security conscious, don't worry, you don't have to use our QR code. You can actually just go to coreview.com, and then in the free tools section, you'll see free health check. And this can help you get better visibility of what's really going on in your tenant. With that said, let's just see very quickly if there are any questions that we need to answer. Okay, I can see a few questions in here about the products. Where are the backups stored? Can I choose? So the configuration backups are stored in the CoreView platform. They're stored as a JSON file. So it's configuration as code effectively, which makes it pretty challenging to figure out what it is if you get access to it. That is all saved inside of the CoreView product, which is hosted in the Azure cloud. And I see one other question here. Does it remediate configuration changes? No, and there's a very specific reason for that. Some configuration changes are legitimate. So we wouldn't want to remediate every configuration change that happens. Sami was saying earlier, this is just part of business, right? People need to change configurations and alter things. And when they do that, you don't want to be constantly reverting it. That'll be frustrating. We want to give you the power to see what's changed so that you can decide, okay, this was appropriate, this wasn't appropriate. One thing we are planning to release, though, in this year is the ability to lock some configurations. So highly sensitive ones that you never want anyone to change without a change process. We're going to give you the ability to lock those, but not everything. With that said, I think those are the main questions I can see. I don't know if there are any that are going to pop up. Sami and Raghu, but before we wrap up, is there anything else that you want to share that came to mind, or you all good?
Yeah, I'm good. I think, this is interesting, right? I mean, definitely a lot of times, right? The one thing last you mentioned, right? Segment-based, controlled access. I think that's one of the things, we strongly recommend, because these days, right, especially you cannot control the access because you cannot just say, hey, I can't give you the privileged access. You'd have to, but how do you control? Doesn't matter whether you have a strong process in place or the views or anything. The segmented access, and the configuration backup. I think that's one of the strong elements of CoreView. So
it's interesting as well because when we were on premise, we used to segment our on-premise environments a lot, and now actually we need to do that in the cloud too. So I think it's about continuation, isn't it?
Yeah, that would have solved the case, what I was mentioning, right? One of our customer, who had the ransom attack or whatever, right? That's because of the similar issue, right? They were working with a lot of vendors. They had to give elevated privilege access, somebody misused it. So.
Yep. Sami?
Yeah, I'm just following basically what Raghu said. Very important topics here, and especially the configuration backups from the critical configurations that you can identify, and identify also those ones that might be a part of attack kill chain to protect your environment better. Very important aspects in my opinion.
Great stuff. Well, I'm really grateful I had both of you guys backing me up today and giving your advice and guidance. Thank you to everyone who's joined. On screen, like I said, you can find more information at CoreView.com, and you can find our free health check. And of course, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to help you if you have any concerns about resilience for your Microsoft tenants. But for now, I hope you have a wonderful day. And until next time, thanks a lot. Ciao.
Yeah.
Thank you.